Some secrets sleep for decades. In Hollywood, Florida, two 14-year-old girls stepped into a summer evening in 1975 and vanished forever. Their bodies were found the next morning beside a remote canal, their killers walking free into the shadows of time. For nearly 50 years, families grieved without answers, while evidence waited in silence. Then DNA whispered their names. Robert Clark Keebler and Lawrence Stein, both long dead, both finally exposed. Justice delayed, but truth eternal. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The humid air hung thick over Hollywood, Florida, as afternoon shadows stretched across Barbara Schreiber's front yard. June 18th, 1975. The kind of summer day when time moves slowly, when 14-year-old girls believed the world was safe and tomorrow would always come. Inside the modest suburban home, Barbara's parents prepared for another ordinary evening. Unaware that ordinary was about to shatter forever, Barbara moved through the house with the easy confidence of youth. Her dark hair catching the filtered sunlight streaming through curtains. She had just finished 8th grade, that pivotal moment when childhood begins its slow retreat and the future feels limitless. The promise of summer stretched ahead, sleepovers, friends, long nights filled with whispered secrets and shared dreams. The doorbell rang, and Barbara's face lit up. Darlene Zetterower stood on the front steps, her smile bright against the golden afternoon light. The girls had been inseparable for months, bound by the fierce loyalty that defines teenage friendship. They moved through their world with the unconscious grace of those who have never known real danger. "Ready for tonight?" Darlene asked, adjusting the small bag slung over her shoulder. The sleepover had been planned for days, a simple pleasure that required nothing more than permission and the promise to be careful. Barbara's mother watched from the kitchen window as the girls talked quietly on the front porch. Hollywood had always felt safe, a place where children rode their bikes until streetlights came on. Parents worried more about scraped knees than strangers in vans. The local newspapers painted their community as the embodiment of suburban security, where the biggest concerns were traffic and teenage curfews. "We'll be back tomorrow afternoon," Barbara called to her parents, her voice carrying the casual certainty of youth. There was no reason to doubt her words. No shadow of premonition in the warm air. This was simply another summer evening in a neighborhood where nothing terrible ever happened. As dusk approached, the girls stepped out into the fading daylight, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Warm evening air settled over the residential streets as streetlights began their nightly awakening. Barbara and Darlene walked side by side, their conversation mixing with the distant sounds of dinner preparations and televisions flickering to life in living rooms. The humidity wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, and the promise of night adventures made their steps light and purposeful. They were heading toward their friend's house, a destination that felt as safe and familiar as their own bedrooms. The route took them through quiet neighborhoods where children still played in front yards. Teenagers gathered in small groups on street corners. This was the Hollywood they knew, predictable, protective, unchanging. But somewhere between Barbara's front door and their intended destination, the night shifted. A witness would later report seeing two girls near a van, talking to men whose faces remained hidden in shadow. The witness thought nothing of it at the time. Teenagers often gathered around vehicles, and summer evenings were full of casual encounters that meant nothing. One of the men inside the van would eventually be confirmed as Robert Clark Keebler. Though his name would remain unknown for decades, his presence on that street corner was not random. It was predatory, calculated, evil, masquerading as opportunity. The second man, later identified as Lawrence Stein, sat beside him, equally complicit in what would unfold. Neighbors later recalled that summer evenings were alive with young people. Teenagers were everywhere, walking in groups, riding bikes, gathering at local hangouts. The sight of two girls talking to adults in a van should have triggered concern. But in 1975, stranger danger was not yet part of the collective consciousness. Trust was the default setting, and caution was reserved for obviously threatening situations. The witness watched briefly, then turned away, distracted by their own evening routines. No formal report was made. No license plate was recorded. The van became just another vehicle in the flow of suburban traffic. An hour later, darkness settled. Fully over Hollywood, and Darlene Zetterower and Barbara Schreiber disappeared into the night. Years later, investigators would reconstruct the timeline with painstaking precision, trying to understand the exact moments when two innocent girls encountered their killers. The van meeting had been officially placed between dusk and nightfall, a window of time when visibility was poor and witnesses were scarce. The vehicle description existed only in memory-sketchy details that became more unreliable with each passing year. No one had thought to write down a license plate number or note distinctive markings. In 1975, such precautions seemed unnecessary. In a community that believed danger was something that happened elsewhere, the second man in the van would eventually be identified through DNA and witness information as Lawrence Stein, a name that carried no meaning in 1975, but would become central to the case decades later. Together, Keebler and Stein represented a combination of predatory intent that had crossed paths with innocent youth at the worst possible moment. As the van disappeared into the growing darkness, whispered fear began to ripple through the community. Unconfirmed sightings would emerge in the following days. Other vehicles, other suspicious encounters, but none would provide the clarity investigators desperately needed. The girls' absence had not yet triggered official alarm. Missing teenagers often meant sleepovers that ran late or spontaneous changes of plans. Parents, in 1975, operated under different assumptions about safety and communication. Cell phones didn't exist to provide constant contact, and worry was often delayed by the belief that children were simply being children. Meanwhile, at both households, parents began to feel the first stirrings of unease as midnight approached, and neither girl had called to check in. After midnight, the peaceful silence of two homes was broken by the sound of parents pacing hardwood floors and making increasingly frantic phone calls. At the Zetterower house, Darlene's mother dialed number after number, trying to reach anyone who might know where the girls had gone. At the Schreiber home, Barbara's father checked and rechecked the clock, his worry growing with each passing hour. The girls' absence had transformed from unusual to alarming. In the span of a few hours, phone logs would later show multiple attempts to reach friends' homes, each call ending in disappointment and escalating concern. Parents spoke to other parents, trying to piece together plans that now seemed deliberately vague and incomplete. No one had seen the girls after they left Barbara's house that evening. The fact seemed impossible in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, where teenagers rarely moved through the community without being noticed by multiple sets of watchful eyes. The absence of witnesses was the first sign that something was genuinely wrong. Rising, worry began to spread among neighbors as word of the missing girls made its way through the community's informal networks. Hollywood was the kind of place where news traveled quickly through phone calls and over fence conversations. The fear was still manageable, still contained within the realm of possibilities that didn't include violence or tragedy. No official missing person action had been taken yet due to the brief time lapse. Police departments in 1975 often waited longer before beginning formal searches. Operating under the assumption that teenagers frequently stayed out later than planned, the clock had to tick longer before official worry would match parental intuition. As sunrise approached, families prepared to contact authorities, their hope beginning to fracture under the weight of silence. The sun rose on June 19th with cruel indifference, painting the Florida sky in soft pastels that mocked the darkness growing in two families' hearts. Miles away from the suburban neighborhoods where parents waited for news, family had risen early to try their luck. Fishing along the remote canals near us 27, the Everglades stretched endlessly around them, a wilderness where silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through soras and the distant call of waiting birds. The still air carried the promise of another humid day, and the quiet water reflected the pale morning light like a mirror. This was a place where people came to escape the noise of civilization, where the natural world reclaimed its dominance and human presence felt temporary and small, but nature had been violated. As the fishing family arranged their gear along the canal bank, they discovered what would change everything: two young bodies lying side by side on the embankment. Their lives ended with violent precision. The peaceful morning shattered into fragments of horror and disbelief. Darlene and Barbara had been found. Their clothing remained intact. An early examination confirmed what the medical examiner would later document in clinical detail. Both had been shot. No evidence of sexual assault was immediately apparent, though the full scope of what had happened to them in their final hours would never be completely known. The location was 4 miles north of Andytown, deep in the Everglades, where discovery might have taken weeks or months. The choice of dumping site spoke to familiarity with the area and a calculated understanding of how to dispose of evidence. The remoteness was intentional, designed to delay discovery and complicate investigation. Word spread through the community with the speed of tragedy. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to warn parents to watch their children. The peaceful bubble of suburban security had been punctured, and fear began to flow into the spaces where trust had once lived. Hours later, investigators arrived at the scene, their vehicles kicking up dust along the remote access road. Under the harsh Everglades sun, crime scene technicians worked methodically to document and preserve every detail of the scene. Yellow police tape fluttered in the warm breeze, marking the boundary between the natural world and the unnatural violence that had intruded upon it. The location offered both advantages and challenges. Isolation that had delayed discovery, but terrain that made evidence collection difficult. The bodies were removed with careful precision, each step documented and photographed. The canal embankment was examined inch by inch, though the remote setting and waterlogged terrain had already compromised much of what might have been useful trace evidence. Investigators searched for shell casings, footprints, tire tracks, any physical remnant of the killer's presence. Items of clothing were preserved with the kind of meticulous care that would prove crucial decades later. In 1975, DNA analysis was still science fiction, but proper evidence handling had always been the cornerstone of good police work. What seemed like routine procedure would eventually become the key to solving the case. The scene matched other canal cases that had terrorized South Florida during the era, a series of murders that would become known in local lore, but never definitively connected. The pattern was becoming familiar. Young victims, remote locations, violence without apparent motive. Radio stations continued their warnings throughout the morning, advising parents to keep children close and watch for suspicious vehicles. The community's sense of security had evaporated overnight, replaced by a vigilance that felt foreign and exhausting. Phone calls flooded police departments as residents reported every van, every stranger, every detail that had seemed innocent the day before. No shell casings were found at the scene, and the waterlogged terrain had destroyed most traces of the killer's presence. The Everglades had claimed the evidence as efficiently as it had hidden the crime. That afternoon, at the medical examiner's office, the investigation would take its next crucial step. The medical examiner worked with clinical precision in the sterile environment of the autopsy suite, documenting injuries with the kind of careful attention that honored the victims while serving the demands of justice. The afternoon light filtered through high windows, casting everything in the harsh clarity that marked the boundary between life and death. Cause of death was determined through methodical examination. Both girls had died from gunshot wounds. Their lives ended with brutal efficiency. The examiner's steady hands documented every detail, creating a record that would remain accurate decades later. When the case finally found resolution, clothing was collected and preserved, according to the protocols of 1975, procedures that seemed routine at the time, but would prove invaluable to future investigators. Early biological traces were documented and stored, though the technology to analyze them properly would not exist for years to come. The examiner's meticulous approach to evidence preservation unknowingly created the foundation for eventual justice. The examination confirmed no definitive evidence of sexual assault, a finding that would shape how investigators approached the case. The violence appeared focused and purposeful rather than opportunistic, though the true motive would remain forever hidden. Outside the medical facility, the public had begun comparing these murders to the infamous flat tire killings that had plagued the region. Newspapers ran headlines that connected desperate cases through geography and method, creating a narrative of serial violence that may or may not have been accurate. The comparison added another layer of fear to a community already reeling from loss. Forensic technology in 1975 was insufficient for the kind of deeper analysis that would eventually solve the Send case. But the examiner's work established a baseline of fact that would endure. Every sample collected, every measurement recorded, every photograph taken would eventually contribute to the DNA breakthrough that lay decades in the future. Investigators regrouped that evening, adding new case notes to files that would eventually grow thick with dead-end leads and frustrated hope. Through late June and into July 1975, detectives worked the case with the methodical persistence that marked good police work in an era before digital databases and automated searches. The van sighting had become the central lead. Though the sketchy descriptions provided frustratingly little to work with, no license plate, no distinctive markings. Just the memory of two men in a vehicle that had disappeared into the vastness of South Florida. Interviews with locals produced the usual collection of tips and theories, most leading nowhere but all requiring investigation. The men in the van would not be identified for decades. Robert Clark Keebler and Lawrence Stein remained unknown names attached to unknown faces, their crimes hidden behind the anonymity that protected predators in an age before surveillance cameras and digital tracking. The case began to appear in newspapers alongside other canal murders, creating a narrative of widespread violence that terrified residents and frustrated investigators. The pattern seemed clear to observers, but connections remained elusive to those charged with solving the crimes. Each case had its own evidence, its own timeline, its own gaps in the record that made definitive links impossible. No arrests were made despite the intensive investigation. The trail had gone cold almost immediately, victim to the limitations of 1970s. Forensic science and the careful planning of killers who understood how to avoid detection. Weeks of investigation produced volumes of paperwork, but no breakthrough. No moment of revelation that would bring justice for Darlene and Barbara. As weeks turned into months, the case began its slow slide into the cold file storage that claimed so many investigations of the era. The evidence was carefully cataloged and preserved, though no one could have predicted how long it would wait in silence before technology caught up with truth. The case entered dormcancy, joining the growing collection of unsolved crimes that haunted investigators and families alike. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, evidence boxes gathered dust in climate-controlled storage rooms. While life moved forward around the silence left by unsolved crimes, detectives rotated through different assignments, carrying the weight of open cases that had defeated their best efforts. The Schreiber file remained in cold storage, its physical items preserved, but its investigative momentum lost to time and circumstance. The community's memory began to fade in the way that trauma eventually recedes when there are no answers to sustain the pain. What had once been front-page news became historical. Note discussed and whispered conversations about the bad old days when young people weren't safe. Even in suburban neighborhoods, the physical evidence remained perfectly preserved in storage. Clothing, samples, photographs, documentation that maintained its integrity even as hope dimmed. No one could have predicted that these carefully cataloged items would eventually become the key to solving a case that seemed destined to remain forever open. The canal murders had become historically infamous in South Florida, part of the region's dark folklore about a time when violence seemed random and justice seemed impossible. The cases were referenced in true crime documentaries and academic studies about serial violence. But the perpetrators remained phantoms whose names existed nowhere in official records. Public fear had evolved into resignation as years passed without arrests or revelations. Parents remained vigilant, but the acute terror of 1975 had settled into the background, awareness of danger that marks any community touched by unsolved violence. Life continued, shaped by loss, but not defined by it. Families clung to fading hope, marking anniversaries and maintaining memorials for daughters whose killers walked free in a world that seemed to have forgotten their names. The wait for justice had become a way of life sustained by love and stubborn refusal to accept that some questions would never be answered. Years continued to pass, carrying the case further from its origins, but not from its power to wound. The 1990s brought revolutionary advances in forensic science that began to reshape cold case investigation across the nation. DNA analysis emerged from laboratory novelty to practical tool, offering the possibility of solving crimes that had seemed permanently closed to traditional investigation. Police departments nationwide began to modernize their capabilities, investing in technology that could extract answers from evidence decades old. Cold cases that had moldered in storage were suddenly viable again. What had once been just cloth fibers and unknown stains could now be transformed into genetic fingerprints, unique to individual perpetrators. The science fiction of one generation had become the standard procedure of the next, creating possibilities that investigators of the 1970s could never have imagined. Lab facilities across the country upgraded their equipment and trained technicians in techniques that could pull identity from microscopic traces of biological material. The backlog of cold cases created demand that often exceeded capacity, but progress was being made on cases that families had given up hope of seeing resolved. Broward County eventually formed a cold case unit dedicated specifically to applying modern techniques to historical crimes. The unit represented both technological advancement and commitment to the principle that time should not grant immunity to those who would escape justice through luck or limitation. This particular case, however, had not yet been selected for modern testing. The Schreiber file remained in its storage location, waiting for the combination of available resources and investigative priority that would bring it back into active consideration. Dozens of similar cases competed for attention, each representing families who still hoped for answers. Documentaries and television programs began to revisit the crimes of the 1970s, bringing renewed public attention to cases that had faded from active memory. The media attention sometimes generated new tips or witnesses, but more often it simply reminded communities of tragedies that time had not healed. Until one day, decades after the original investigation had gone cold, the unit received the old evidence boxes that would change everything. The cold case unit's office had the quiet intensity of a place where old mysteries come to die or find resurrection. Fluorescent lights hummed over desks covered with file folders, each one representing a family's unanswered questions and an investigator's unfinished business. When detectives pulled the evidence boxes for the Zetterower or Schreiber case, they approached the task with the methodical hope that defined their work. Inside the boxes, carefully preserved in plastic evidence bags, were the clothing samples that had been collected in 1975. The detectives' experience had taught them to look past the yellowed labels and faded documentation to focus on the potential that lay hidden in fabric fibers and microscopic traces. These items had waited nearly 3 decades for science to catch up with justice. The clothing samples were flagged for modern DNA testing, a process that would have seemed like magic to the investigators who had first handled them. What appeared to be nothing more than stained fabric could now be analyzed with precision that revealed the genetic identity of anyone who would come into contact with the victims during their final hours. Preserved biological material was located on multiple items, though years of storage had inevitably caused some degradation. The key was finding samples that had remained uncontaminated for decades, protected by proper handling and storage protocols that had been followed faithfully since 1975. The chain of custody documentation was intact, ensuring that any results would be legally admissible. The families were contacted with careful words about cautious hope. Cold case work had taught the detectives not to promise outcomes, but to prepare families for the possibility that answers might finally be within reach. The conversations were difficult, reopening old wounds while offering the possibility of healing that had seemed impossible for so long. Processing backlogs at the laboratory meant that results would not arrive quickly. But for families who had waited decades, a few more months seemed manageable. The most important step had been taken. Evidence was being analyzed that could finally provide the names of the men who had destroyed 2 young lives. Months later, a sealed envelope arrived at the cold case unit containing results that would transform grief into knowledge. The envelope sat on the detective's desk for a moment before being opened, its contents representing the culmination of months of careful laboratory work and decades of family hope. Inside the DNA report contained the kind of breakthrough that cold case investigators dream about, but rarely experience a clear, unambiguous match that connected decades-old evidence to a name in the database: Robert Clark Keebler. The name meant nothing to the families or the community, but it meant everything to the case. Biological trace evidence on the victim's clothing had provided a private genetic profile that matched Keebler's DNA with scientific certainty. After nearly half a century, one of the killers had been identified with precision that left no room for doubt. The match confirmed what witnesses had reported in 1975, that the girls had encountered their killers through direct contact, though the specific details of that encounter would never be fully known. The biological evidence spoke to violence that had been personal and purposeful, though motive remained hidden behind decades of silence. But the breakthrough came with devastating qualification. Robert Clark Keebler had died in 2019, 4 years before his identification. The man who had taken 2 young lives and walked free for decades would never face questioning, never sit in a courtroom, never be forced to confront the families he had destroyed. Justice had been delayed until it became impossible. News of a major development began to circulate in media reports. Though details remained confidential while investigators pursued additional leads, the community that had lived with unanswered questions for so long began to stir with anticipation and dread, knowing that breakthrough often came with complication. The identification of Keebler had answered one critical question while raising others. Witnesses had reported to men in the van that night, and investigators knew their work was only half finished. The search continued for the identity of the second perpetrator, the man who had shared responsibility for violence that had haunted a community for decades. Investigators pushed deeper into the case files, determined to complete what DNA had started. The cold case unit's investigation intensified as detectives worked to identify the second man who had been with Keebler on that fatal night in 1975. DNA analysis and witness information eventually led them to Lawrence Stein, a name that completed the picture of what had happened to Darlene Zetterower and Barbara Schreiber during their final hours. The timeline that investigators had painstakingly reconstructed over months of careful work now included both perpetrators. Evidence placed Stein with Keebler in the van, making him equally responsible for the violence that followed. The genetic fingerprints and witness accounts created a complete picture of the encounter that had begun on a suburban street and ended beside a remote canal. But Lawrence Stein had died in 2005, 14 years before his identification, and 18 years before the case would be officially solved. Like his partner in violence, he had escaped earthly justice through the simple passage of time. Both men had lived full lives after destroying 2 young ones, the crimes hidden behind inadequate forensic science and their own careful avoidance of detection. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning. The community braced itself for news that would finally answer questions that had festered for decades. Sheriff's Office officials prepared to announce what families had waited nearly 50 years to hear: the names of the men who had killed their daughters. The identification of both perpetrators created a complex emotional landscape for families and investigators alike. Truth had finally emerged, but it came without the possibility of confrontation or trial. Justice would have to take a different form, shaped by revelation rather than retribution. The community that had lived with fear and uncertainty was about to learn that monsters do have names, even when those names are spoken over graves rather than in courtrooms. The next morning would bring an end to one kind of suffering and the beginning of another kind of healing. The press gathered as dawn broke, preparing to document the moment when a decades-old mystery would finally be solved. The Sheriff's Office press conference drew media attention from across South Florida as reporters and cameras filled the room where decades of silence would finally be broken. Officials approached the podium with the gravity appropriate to the moment, knowing they were about to provide answers that families had carried as burdens for nearly half their lives. The announcement was methodical and precise. DNA evidence had positively identified Robert Clark Keebler and Lawrence Stein as the perpetrators of the 1975 murders of Darlene Zetterower and Barbara Schreiber. Both men had been confirmed through biological trace evidence and witness information that had waited decades for technology capable of providing definitive answers. If both suspects had been alive, officials explained, charges would have been filed without hesitation. The evidence was clear. The genetic matches were unambiguous, and the case would have proceeded to trial with confidence. But death had created a legal barrier that could not be overcome through determination or advanced science. The reconstruction of events placed both men in the van that had been reported by witnesses, confirming that the encounter between the girls and their killers had been exactly as described by those who had observed it from a distance. The timeline that investigators had constructed through careful analysis matched the physical evidence with precision that removed any doubt about responsibility. Public shock rippled through the community as the names were released. Decades-old fear resurged as residents realized that the men who had terrorized their neighborhood had faces and histories that could finally be examined. The revelation transformed abstract terror into concrete knowledge, though not necessarily into comfort. Some community members felt relief at finally knowing, while others struggled with the reality that justice had been delayed beyond the possibility of legal resolution. The complexity of emotions reflected the unusual nature of a case solved too late for traditional prosecution, but not too late for truth. Families stepped forward after the conference to face reporters who had gathered to document their long-awaited reaction to news, had never stopped hoping they would hear. In a private room at the sheriff's office, away from the cameras and media attention, the families of Darlene Zetterower and Barbara Schreiber received a detailed briefing about the investigation that had finally provided their daughter's killers with names and faces. The moment was both culmination and complication, the end of a search that had lasted longer than their daughters had lived. Investigators presented the confirmed timeline with careful precision, explaining how DNA analysis had connected biological evidence to genetic profiles in the database. The scientific breakthrough was explained in terms that honored both the complexity of the process and the family's need to understand exactly how truth had been extracted from decades-old evidence. The lack of clear motive remained one of the investigation's unanswered questions. Despite identifying the perpetrators, investigators could not explain why Keebler and Stein had chosen to kill two innocent teenagers. The violence appeared purposeful, but without discernible reason, leaving families to grapple with senselessness that defied understanding. The evidence that had been preserved in 1975 had made the breakthrough possible, a fact that investigators emphasized as they praised the careful work of their predecessors. Proper handling and storage protocols had maintained the integrity of biological samples for nearly 5 decades, creating the foundation for justice that had seemed impossible when the evidence was first collected. Quotes began to circulate as family members struggled to articulate emotions that had no precise vocabulary. One family member was reported as saying, "The identification gives us some closure," though the words carried the weight of qualification that reflected the complex nature of resolution without retribution. The emotional clash between relief and renewed grief filled the private space where families processed information they had waited half their lives to receive. Tears mixed with resolve as they held photographs of daughters who would remain forever young while their killers had been allowed to age into natural death. Investigators prepared to file the final paperwork that would officially close a case that had defined careers and shaped lives for decades. The state attorney's office reviewed the findings with the legal rigor that the case demanded. Even though prosecution had become impossible through the passage of time, the classification of exceptionally cleared required careful evaluation of evidence to ensure that the legal standard had been met. Despite the unusual circumstances, the evidence was more than sufficient to support charges. If the suspects had been alive, DNA matches provided scientific certainty. Witness accounts corroborated the timeline, and the preserved physical evidence created a case that would have proceeded to trial with confidence. The legal system's inability to prosecute was a function of mortality, not inadequate proof. Officials described both suspects as having lived very violent lives. Though details of their criminal histories remained confidential, the characterization suggested that the murders of Darlene and Barbara had been part of a pattern of violence that had marked both men's existence. Though specific connections to other crimes were not established, the community debated what cold case justice meant when traditional prosecution was impossible. Some residents found comfort in knowing that the truth had been revealed, while others struggled with the absence of courtroom accountability. The philosophical questions raised by delayed justice had no easy answers. The exceptional clearance represented the legal system's acknowledgement that truth and justice could take different forms when time created barriers that could not be overcome through investigation or determination. The classification honored both the quality of evidence and the reality of circumstance. Legal scholars and victims' rights advocates would later examine the case as an example of how advances in forensic science could provide answers without providing traditional closure. The complexity of delayed justice reflected broader questions about how society balances the demands of accountability with the realities of time. As the case was formally closed, investigators reflected on the unusual satisfaction of solving a mystery that had haunted their department for decades. Even though resolution had come without the possibility of traditional legal consequences, investigators presented the complete sequence of events with the precision that had marked their months of careful reconstruction. The timeline began with two girls leaving home for what they believed would be an ordinary evening with friends and ended with their bodies beside a remote canal, their killers disappearing into decades of anonymity. The girls had left home in the early evening, walking through familiar neighborhoods where they had moved safely countless times before. They had entered the van willingly, though whether through deception or force would never be known. The encounter that witnesses had observed from a distance had been the beginning of violence that would end their lives within hours. The overnight period remained largely unknown, though evidence suggested the girls had been killed relatively quickly after their abduction. The remote location where their bodies were discovered had been chosen for its isolation, a calculated decision that delayed discovery and complicated investigation. The killer's familiarity with the Everglades suggested local knowledge or experience with the area. The dumping site in the Everglades reflected both practical and psychological considerations, remote enough to avoid immediate discovery, but accessible enough to reach without specialized equipment. The location spoke to planning that went beyond opportunistic violence. The choice revealed killers who understood how to minimize risk while maximizing the chances that evidence would be degraded by time and weather. Combined witness accounts, DNA analysis, and geographic reconstruction had created a complete picture of the crime. Despite the decades that had passed since its commission, modern investigative techniques had extracted truth from evidence that had seemed inadequate at the time of its collection. The public reflected on the vulnerability that had characterized teenage life in 1975, when trust was the default assumption and stranger danger was not yet part of the cultural vocabulary. The case served as a reminder of how dramatically society's awareness of predatory behavior had evolved. Investigators prepared to speak publicly about the case that had consumed months of their professional lives and decades of institutional memory. Local television stations ran comprehensive coverage that documented not just the breakthrough in the case, but the cultural impact that the canal murders had exerted on South Florida for decades. The story had become part of regional folklore, a reminder of a time when violence had seemed random and justice had appeared impossible. Archival footage from 1975 showed the community as it had existed when the girls were killed, a more trusting place where children moved. Through public spaces with less supervision, and adults operated under different rents. Assumptions about safety. The contrast with contemporary security awareness was stark and sobering. The case was likely separate from other flat tire murders that had terrorized the region during the same period, according to investigators who had examined patterns and evidence across multiple unsolved crimes. While geographic and temporal proximity had created public perception of connection, the evidence suggested these were distinct acts of violence by different perpetrators. Residents recalled living in fear during the summer of 1975 when every van became suspicious, and every stranger represented potential threat. The community had existed in a state of heightened vigilance that was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Normal life had eventually reasserted itself, but the underlying sense of security had been permanently altered. The media retrospective included interviews with neighbors who remembered the girls and the impact their deaths had exerted on local families. The loss had rippled through the community in ways that extended far beyond the immediate families, creating a shared trauma that had shaped how children were supervised and how trust was distributed. Some residents still questioned whether Keebler and Stein had committed other crimes during the same period. Though no definitive connections had been established, the speculation reflected the community's struggle to understand how much damage the two men had inflicted during their lives. The cold case unit prepared public statements about the methodology that had made the breakthrough possible and the commitment to continue pursuing similar cases. The cold case laboratory explained their methodology in terms that honored both scientific precision and public understanding, demonstrating how advances in DNA analysis had transformed what was possible in forensic investigation. The breakthrough had required not just technological advancement, but careful preservation of evidence across decades. The biological trace evidence on the victim's clothing had persisted despite years of storage. Though degradation was inevitable over such an extended period, the key had been finding samples that retained enough genetic material for analysis while maintaining the chain of custody integrity required for legal admissibility. Details of the analysis process revealed how microscopic quantities of biological material could be amplified and sequenced to create genetic profiles unique to individual contributors. What had been invisible to investigators in 1975 had become readable text in the language of genetics, transforming cloth fibers into conclusive identification. The evidence had maintained its integrity through careful storage protocols that had been followed faithfully since the original investigation. Temperature control, proper packaging, meticulous documentation had created the conditions necessary for eventual analysis. Though no one in 1975 could have predicted how crucial these procedures would become, the public gained renewed respect for forensic science as they learned how patient methodology could extract answers from evidence decades old. The breakthrough represented not just technological advancement, but institutional commitment to the principle that time should not grant immunity to those who had escaped justice through circumstance. Some evidence had proven too degraded to answer questions about motive or additional details of the crime. While DNA could identify the perpetrators with certainty, could not explain why they had chosen to kill or whether other crimes might be connected to their actions. The limitations of science reminded everyone that some questions would remain forever unanswered. The laboratory's work had required months of careful analysis, balancing the need for thorough investigation with the family's decades of waiting. Each step of the process had been documented and verified to ensure that results would be legally and scientifically unassailable. As interviews with investigators continued, the focus shifted from methodology to meaning what the HHE breakthrough represented for families who had never stopped hoping for answers. The laboratory lights clicked off as another day of forensic work concluded, leaving behind the quiet hum of refrigeration units, preserving evidence for cases yet to be solved. Families gathered privately away from media attention to process the complex emotions that accompanied justice without trial. The identification of their daughter's killers had provided the answers they had sought for decades. But those answers came without the possibility of courtroom confrontation that might have offered a different kind of closure. The processing of truth without retribution required emotional work that had no guidebook or precedent. Families found themselves grateful for knowledge, while grieving the impossibility of traditional justice. The men who had destroyed their daughters' lives had been allowed to live full lives themselves, dying natural deaths while their victims remained forever. 14. Final reports were reviewed with careful attention to detail. Though families had already absorbed the essential truth, Robert Clark, Keebler, and Lawrence Stein had killed Darlene and Barbara, and both men were beyond earthly accountability. The bureaucratic conclusion felt anticlimactic after decades of hope for dramatic resolution. One family member's statement that the identification gives us some closure to smile again captured the qualified nature of their relief. The words acknowledged both the importance of truth and the limitations of delayed justice, reflecting emotions too complex for simple vocabulary. The community held a remembrance vigil that honored both the victims and the persistence that had finally provided their names with justice. Candlelight flickered against the evening darkness as residents gathered to acknowledge both loss and resolution. The ceremony marked not celebration, but recognition that truth had value even when it came too late for punishment. The lack of courtroom confrontation left an emotional gap that families would have to fill through private processing and public memorial. Some wounds could be healed by knowledge, while others required different forms of resolution that would unfold over years rather than moments. As the case entered its closing phase, investigators prepared to document the end of an investigation that had spanned longer than their careers. The detectives signed the final case closure document with the solemnity appropriate to ending an investigation that had consumed institutional memory for decades. The signature marked not triumph, but completion. A case solved through persistence and scientific advancement rather than traditional police work. The official end to investigative efforts brought mixed emotions to those who had worked the case. Satisfaction at providing families with answers was tempered by frustration that justice had been delayed beyond the possibility of prosecution. The case would be remembered as both breakthrough and reminder of how time could complicate the pursuit of accountability. The case file was labeled solved with a notation that both perpetrators had been deceased at the time of identification. The unusual circumstances required careful documentation to ensure that future researchers would understand both the success of the investigation and the limitations imposed by mortality. The cold case unit continued its work on other files, applying lessons learned from this investigation to cases that might still result in arrests and trials. Each solved case provided methodology and hope for families whose wait for answers continued. The institutional knowledge gained through this investigation would inform future efforts. The public thanked investigators for their persistence. Through letters and calls that acknowledged the emotional cost of carrying unsolved cases across years and career changes, the gratitude was meaningful to detectives who had learned to measure success differently when traditional metrics were unavailable. Some questions would remain forever unanswered. Despite the identification of the perpetrators, motive, additional crimes, and specific details of the victim's final hours had been buried with Keebler and Stein, taking secrets that would never be recovered through investigation or analysis. In the weeks following case closure, the community continued to process the complex emotions that accompanied delayed justice. Community centers and local organizations began incorporating the case into educational discussions about safety history and the evolution of investigative techniques. The story became a cautionary lesson that balanced awareness with hope, demonstrating both the reality of danger and the possibility of eventual justice. The timeline was printed in local educational materials as an example of how forensic science could solve crimes that seemed permanently closed to traditional investigation. Students learned about DNA analysis through a case that had directly affected their community, making abstract science personally relevant. The case highlighted the crucial importance of preserving evidence even when immediate analysis was impossible. The careful work of 1975 investigators had unknowingly created the foundation for 2023 justice, demonstrating how professional procedures could have consequences across decades. Residents reflected on how their community had changed since 1975, noting increased security awareness and different assumptions about trust and safety. The evolution was both loss of innocence and gain of knowledge, reflecting broader societal changes that extended far beyond their neighborhood. Debates continued over whether more could have been done during the original investigation, though most observers acknowledged that 1975 technology had simply been inadequate for the kind of analysis that eventually solved the case. The question was academic, but reflected the human need to believe that better outcomes were always possible. Memorial touches appeared throughout the community as residents found ways to honor Darlene and Barbara while acknowledging the persistence that had finally provided their story with resolution. Gardens, plaques, and quiet spaces served as reminders that some losses could be transformed into lasting memory. The case had become part of local history, taught and remembered as an example of how time could both complicate and enable justice. The cold case unit gathered for their regular briefing, reaffirming their commitment to applying lessons learned from the Zetterower or Schreiber investigation to similar cases that waited in storage. The successful resolution had provided both methodology and motivation for tackling other files that had seemed permanently closed to traditional investigation. Other files from the 1970s were reviewed with new understanding of how preserved evidence could be analyzed using contemporary techniques. DNA technology continued to advance, making previously impossible analysis routine and offering hope to families whose cases had been cold for decades. The unit's investigators understood that their work represented more than professional obligation. It was a commitment to the principle that truth should not be defeated by time, and that families deserved answers regardless of how long the search required. Each case file represented real people whose lives had been forever altered by violence. Some older samples were now testable using techniques that had not existed even 5 years earlier. The rapid advancement of forensic science meant that cases deemed hopeless could suddenly become viable. Though the backlog of potential analysis often exceeded available resources, families of other victims had begun contacting detectives after learning about the Zetterower or Schreiber breakthrough, hoping that similar analysis could provide answers to their own decades-old questions. The calls were both encouraging and heartbreaking, representing hope that investigators could not always fulfill. Limited staff and resources meant that cases had to be prioritized based on evidence quality, family need, and potential for successful resolution. The decisions were difficult, knowing that every delayed case represented families who continued to wait for truth. The unit's work continued against the backdrop of institutional commitment and personal dedication that had made the recent breakthrough possible. As daylight faded over the cold case unit's offices, investigators reflected on the unusual satisfaction of having solved a case that had haunted their department for decades. Even though resolution had come without traditional legal consequences, the work continued on other files, guided by the understanding that truth had value independent of prosecution. The final reflection took place at the canal site where Darlene and Barbara had been discovered 48 years earlier. The location had changed little since. 1975. The same quiet water, the same endless horizon of soras stretching toward the sunset. Nature had reclaimed any trace of the violence that had once intruded upon its silence. Truth was finally known. Though the form that justice had taken was different from what families had originally hoped, Robert Clark Keebler and Lawrence Stein had been identified with scientific certainty, their responsibility established beyond doubt, even though their deaths had prevented earthly accountability. The final summary of findings was complete. DNA evidence, witness accounts, and careful reconstruction had provided answers to questions that had seemed permanently unanswerable. The breakthrough had required both technological advancement and institutional persistence across decades. Investigators remained uncertain about motive, a gap in understanding that would never be filled despite the identification of the perpetrators. Some questions had been answered with scientific precision, while others remained forever hidden behind death and time. The community had recognized the resilience of families who had never stopped hoping and never stopped honoring their daughter's memory. The long search for truth had become its own form of memorial, ensuring that Darlene and Barbara would be remembered not just as victims, but as catalysts for justice. Peace would have to be rebuilt personally by each family member, shaped by their own understanding of what closure meant when it came without courtroom drama or public trial. The private work of healing continued beyond public attention. Wind rippled across the canal water as evening settled over the Everglades, carrying whispers of memory across a landscape where nature had witnessed both violence and eventual truth. The water reflected the sky with the same indifference it had shown decades earlier, but the silence was no longer empty. It held names finally spoken: Robert Clark Keebler and Lawrence Stein. The truth had found its voice at last.